So other additional risks of learning in medicine. In addition, as students demonstrate their competence, they gradually move from the peripheral participants in that community of practice to more central members of the community. And meaningful engagement with the team and entrance more deeply into the community is an important component of professional identity formation. So the risk of being left on the sidelines can impact future learning as an accepted member of the core of the team. And sincerely, disadvantage some learners from gaining access to future and additional learning opportunities. Somewhat more tangible is performance evaluation. So students may avoid taking risks through asking questions or admitting uncertainty because if they're wrong, their grades may suffer. And getting a few questions wrong during a clinical learning encounter in the OR or on rounds, despite a student who might have an otherwise strong foundation of knowledge, could make the difference in performance evals for the student and subsequently their ability to match to their chosen field or program. So credibility is also at stake and of particular importance for residents and fellows. As interns or junior residents establish that they know their stuff, they gradually gain the trust of their senior residents and faculty. And this trust is the first step to entrustment, or the gaining of increasing independence and autonomy. So let's look again then at our definition of psychological safety. For a student or for residents, it's the need to feel safe taking risks by trying to answer questions to the best of their ability and asking clarifying questions about uncertainties. So for that to happen, psychological safety needs to be present in the team and in the environment. This group of authors went so far as to define educational safety in their research on the concept in medical education. They conducted interviews with just 8 medical students, but those students were participating in a formal mentorship program. And from their qualitative analyses, they suggest that learners need to feel freed from a sense of judgment by others so that they can authentically and wholeheartedly concentrate on engaging with a learning task without a perceived need to self-monitor their projected image. When educational safety is present, students felt that they no longer needed to constantly self-monitor, and that enabled learning. Students described increased concentration on the present moment with little regard for self-preservation. So they were able to detach from ego and focus on the task at hand as if nothing else mattered. Importantly, having supportive relationships with peers and mentors improved psychological safety for students. And it's interesting to me that there was a bidirectional aspect to this. Feeling safe seemed to facilitate relationship building, while relationships also seemed to facilitate safety. When educational safety is absent, learners fear judgment, reprisal, humiliation, feelings of incompetence, and being unworthy, and they may begin to avoid and withdraw from the learning process in an effort to save face. So saving face is not a new concept, and that's been written about in social psychology literature for decades. The active management of one's image was described by a social psychologist, Irving Goffman, as impression management as early as the 1950s. And he described that individuals craft and maintain an image in social circumstances to actively manage the impression others have of them. Asking for help, admitting errors, and seeking feedback exemplify the kinds of behaviors that pose a threat to face, making people in organizations, and particularly learning within healthcare teams, reluctant to disclose errors or uncertainty. So students and residents in the learning environment don't want to admit uncertainty and ask questions. In particular, surgical residents perceive an expectation to demonstrate themselves as competent, and in research have discussed a pressure to be all-knowing, quick, decisive, and confident. So even when they felt confused or uncertain, like the picture on the left, they actually felt this need to manage their impression and give the others on the team the appearance that they have these strongly normative expectations of surgeon stereotype and are very confident. So in this study, they sought to explore impression management in the context of resident learning and performance. And 15 semi-structured interviews were carried out with general surgery residents in one academic medical center in Canada. Residents described sensing an expectation to portray an image aligned with the ideal surgical stereotype of confidence and certainty, and they shared strategies that they used to mirror that image, including some actually kind of scary things, including fabricating stories. So if they didn't know a lab value, they might come up with one that seemed, plausible. Remaining silent and just trying to, not let anyone or not catch anyone's attention, and avoiding calling for help and feeling like they needed to figure things out on their own. So, the intended consequences of this behavior was that the residents were able to build a reputation as competent, shape their evaluations, and also gain access to additional learning opportunities as they gained credibility within their teams. Unfortunately, residents in this study also identified unintended implications for how they learn and how they execute their clinical duties. They felt that impression management hindered their education, affected their wellness, and also affected their ability to care for their patients. So, regarding their education, focusing on impression management or how they would be perceived resulted in an inability to engage in and take full advantage of educational opportunities. They remained silent. They failed to ask clarifying questions and actually articulated that they preferred to look up the information themselves at a later time rather than asking their attending a question that might demonstrate their lack of knowledge. In addition, they felt so preoccupied with whether they would know the answer or have all the information if called upon that they couldn't give their full attention to whatever pearls their clinical faculty was currently sharing. So this brings me to cognitive load theory, and it tells us that there's three components that contribute to the formation of our working memory. Intrinsic load is the complexity of the learning activity at hand. Extrinsic load are the factors external to the learning activity that influence learning, like distractions and unfamiliar jargon. And germane load is the mental energy that we devote to processing that new info. So ideal learning activities optimize intrinsic load and minimize extrinsic load. And the point here being that impression management adds substantially to extrinsic load, and that in turn has detrimental effects on learning. Okay, so now what? What do we do about establishing educational safety? First, I'll turn back to 2006 and another article by Amy Edmondson, Making It Safe, the Effects of Leader Inclusiveness and Professional Status on Psychological Safety and Improvement Efforts in Healthcare Teams. And this team leader behaviors affect learning orientation. So she demonstrated in this study that team members are highly attuned to the behavior of leaders and examine leader actions for information about what's expected and what is acceptable. And she defined leader inclusiveness as words and deeds that are exhibited by leaders, or all of you and myself, that invite and appreciate others' contributions or efforts. And leader inclusiveness was actually found to predict psychological safety and provide a way to moderate the relationship between hierarchy and status and psychological safety. So if leaders demonstrated inclusive words and behaviors, that helped to mitigate some of the hierarchy and power differential within teams. Feedback plays a critical role in workplace learning and health professions education, and can be a particularly vulnerable interaction for learners. So there's generally a power differential and a hierarchy involved between the educator and the learner, and the stakes can be quite high depending if the feedback is formative or summative. Setting the scene for dialogue and candor was one thing that this group discovered played an important role in feedback encounters. So what they looked at here, they took 36 videos of formal feedback encounters between an educator and a learner, and they defined psychologically safe environments as being inferred when the learners progressively disclosed information and engaged in productive learning behaviors during the discussion. So I will say that for this particular research study, that was a little bit of an arbitrary definition in how they looked at those videos and decided whether psychological safety was present or not. But subsequently, when psychological safety was present, these were the themes that they identified as associated educator strategies to promote safety. So first, as I mentioned, setting the scene for dialogue and candor. So educators would kind of set up the interaction with the learner by explicitly stating the importance of having learner input. So they tried to initially set it up that there needed to be a bidirectional conversation and that the learner's input mattered. The educator serving as ally was another theme, where they noticed that educators offered support and assistance to help facilitate learner development and actively tried to reduce the power gap. So they would use terms like we to establish solidarity and express empathy, or reference back to their own experiences in those types of situations to reduce that power gap. And then continuing improvement orientation was another theme. So establishing that gaps or errors are expected for learners and focus on learning strategies to move forward, as opposed to looking at those gaps or errors as failures. And then finally, encouraging interactive dialogue during the feedback session by sharing information and responding to each other's comments. So these are some themes around concrete things that we as educators can do in interactions with learners to progressively establish psychological safety. And then finally, this article, and I understand from Dr. Chan that you recently heard from Dr. Bynum, so that's excellent. But I really enjoyed this Journal of Graduate Medical Education piece about psychological safety and the risks of learning in medicine. And they close with 4 levels of recommendations of things that we can do to work towards establishing educational safety. For faculty, they advised providing difficult feedback, responding to errors, and correcting deficiencies in a non-shaming manner, and recognizing interpersonal distress and naming it when it does occur. For programs, the goal should be to optimize interpersonal communication on teams and address status-based barriers to communication. Program leaders can provide opportunities for learners to build connections with one another and to generate supportive networks within which they can discuss and normalize and share about psychological safety with or without faculty present. And then for institutions, and I think this one is really key, reforming the culture of graduate medical education and remodeling the experience from hierarchical, stressful rite of passage to a process in which learners willingly take risks and endure challenges within the confines of what is an inclusive, nurturing, and safe learning environment. And all of these initiatives need to be coupled with completely eliminating mistreatment, humiliation, harsh pimping, uncivil behavior, and exaggerated power differentials that we're seeing, recognized more and more today as we focus more on burnout and well-being for our trainees. And so that is where I will close and enjoy the opportunity to take some questions and hear just some general dialogue around this topic with the group.